Good morning, everyone. So, luckily we've all seen my slides already, so I can do this quite quickly as we go through it. She's still waiting for. Okay, so they're there now, but not here. So this is exciting, right. Okay, so basically I'm going to be talking about thread-led penetration testing. I hope everybody's still awake, still alive. I've got quite a bad echo here. Sorry. Cool. So just a quick introduction. Basically, who am I? Instead of Harry popping in and actually talking, I replaced him as he had to rush off to London as of Friday, effectively. So this is quite a quick turnaround time. But I started my career back as a pen tester many years ago, basically doing web applications and then infrastructure. We moved across after time towards cyber defense. So cyber defense is our internal thing that we call. It's basically large systems, assessing large systems as a environment over a thing. And then when I found my true passion, effectively it was incident response. So I spent many years in the incident response team, eventually coming up and leading the South African incident response team for F-Secure. And now finally my current role is Consultancy Director, effectively in charge of the local South African office for consultants. Sweet. So what do we actually have to talk about? So we've mentioned threat-led testing. I want to start with a question. I want to open up basically, if you knew you were going to be attacked by an APT, what would you do? This is a fairly realistic thing for pretty much every organization in this room. It's definitely, we hold data, so I like to call myself we, because as part of incident response, I think of myself as part of the blue team. So I like to be included in a team, not just that random vendor that comes across. So when I say we, that's what I mean. So there's two approaches that we can take to this. We can either go down the standard route, which is a perfectly valid route. It's one of the frameworks. We can pick a cybersecurity framework, basically throw a dart at it, and off we go. These are great. Oh, that's all changing. These are great. This is a perfectly valid response. We're going to talk about what other responses are as well. But basically, this is picking a framework to build some security controls so that we can actually get a baseline. When I say baseline here, I want to get a baseline across multiple security domains effectively within our organization. These are industry standards. This is based off of SEF. So SEF is a nice maturity model that exists. If you combine all of those, it comes to about 750 controls that you can implement, which is quite a lot. I don't know if anybody that I know would be able to do that. So lots of people do this. This is a perfectly valid response to this problem that exists. So we went and asked our clients, basically worldwide. If you break down, so we use PPDR internally, so that's just the Gardner Framework. It actually wasn't listed there. But it's basically just breaking it into predict, prevent, detect, and respond, and what those look like. Can I steal a bottle of water quickly? Yeah, and it breaks the client spending where they estimate where they spend the most across those PPDR domains. So, as you can see there, the highest is prevent, sorry. The second highest came out as detect. This is fairly logical to me, and I hope it's pretty logical to everybody. Why? So these are typically areas where you can actually buy technology. You can implement a solution to basically solve this problem. The other two areas, which is response and prediction, you actually need people and processes, and you need to be able to implement systems to solve this problem. So these are really hard areas to actually do things in comparison to the other two. So we take this response. Many people do. They go ahead and they do these things, and off they go. But it doesn't fundamentally answer the question. And the fundamental question that we had was, would we actually be able to defend ourselves against APTs? So we pick APTs for a very specific reason. So I'm not going to dive too deeply into what an APT is. I'm assuming pretty much everybody here knows what an APT is, but I'd like to highlight two important points. One, the advanced part, and two, the persistent part. So when we talk about advanced, we're talking about people who have good capabilities, phenomenal capabilities, but they're marrying their capabilities against what they're seeing in terms of the defensive organization where they sit. And I want to talk about persistent a little bit. Why persistent? Oh, this actually didn't come out very nicely. When we talk about persistent, we're saying persistent because they go and they're trying to achieve an objective, and they'll work until they get that objective. So what do we mean by that? They come up against the good control, they're not going to just give up and move off. They come up against that control and they spend time trying to bypass that control, time trying to get around it and actually implement something. If we're talking about APTs, we typically use the example of a nation state. A nation state typically does these sort of attacks and these sort of goals and exercises to achieve a political objective. Their political objective hasn't gone because you've prevented them from getting in. That's an important thing to remember. They're still trying to get that objective and go forward. So I think that branches off nicely into defense. What do we mean by defense in this case? So we're talking about APTs as our threat that's basically coming up against us. Defense is a complicated word and it's not easy. It's something that's actually really hard and takes a lot of time for us to do. We've mentioned that APTs are both advanced and persistent. So defense suddenly becomes a really hard thing to do and continuously do. And I think it's important that we need to reiterate the continuous part. This has now effectively become a race where the attackers are, we've said they're persistent and they're constantly coming back and trying to bypass our controls. And we as the defenders need to constantly be on our guard and trying to defend against that. So I think that introduces nicely the baseline of the talk. So let's try and answer that question again. How would we defend ourselves against an APT? It's hard. There's one of two ways that we can do this. We can either do it by being attacked by the APT and seeing what happens then. It's a little bit of a real-world live-fire example. I don't think that's the best approach. I'm going to talk through an example closer to the end of the presentation where we actually see this happen and what the effect it was. A better approach for me is to actually simulate the adversary and see what we can do in the real world in a live fire example where we trust the third party that we're going up against. We have a way to talk to them and deal with them and actually interact. Unfortunately, yes, this means there's more frameworks, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. In this case, we're talking about, so it's worth mentioning here that this is not something that we came up with. This is industry standards implemented in many places all over the world. Stuff like Tiber, CBEST, STAR, effectively red teams. It's a little bit of a different approach. These are all well-defined systems that exist for people to achieve specific goals. So in this case, it's performing red teams under a specific guide and process and procedure to basically assess the security gaps within an organization. Cool. So it's worth also just touching on here that although these are well-defined and they're all over the world, there are specific industry verticals where there are slight differences, such as the N-best for nuclear, T-best for telcos, and G-best for government. Many frameworks exist for these types of things, and they're being pushed out wider and wider. This is still important. There's still one important point that I need to take out of this, or that you need to hear as part of that. This is not the silver bullet for security. There still isn't one. There never will be. Well, hopefully there is one eventually, but there isn't one at this point. It's not the solution. It's one solution. Why do we say it's only one solution, and why do we think it's a pretty good solution? There's a couple of benefits that come out of this. So now we've done, and let's say, starting from the right at the beginning, we've gone through one of these assessments with our trusted third-party provider. We now have somebody who's emulated the threat or simulated the threat. They've gone through all of our controls. They found out where we're strong, where we're weak, which controls are effective. They've got a little bit of a better guide in terms of what the actual capabilities and the real-world effectiveness of our controls are. They understand what they battled with. They understand where they went and what they did to get and achieve what their objective is. This is powerful for us, especially if we can talk to them and have a conversation about what their misalignment is. So a very nice or a nice thing to understand from their perspective. They have the offensive view. They've seen what our environment actually looks like from a offensive landscape. So they can have a look and we can have conversations about what's actually different. What is completely opposite of what we thought? Which network is not segregated off as we suspected? They have these real-world understanding of how our controls that we implemented are failing, are achieving stuff, are doing what we need them to do. So it's marrying that security strategy as defined by those frameworks with this real-world, what the actual effectiveness of what our controls are. And that is nice, because now we can suddenly use that to understand how we should be spending our money effectively. So this sort of insight provides us a nice view to realigning where we should be focusing, what we should be spending on. We can be looking much more at, one of the key things that we see is actually that they've spent all this money in prevention and detection. Suddenly an attack happens. How do you respond? It's really hard to get good response people and keep them, because once you train them up, they suddenly become a valuable resource that can go pretty much anywhere. So now we can realign our security spend, understanding which controls in terms of a prevention and detection capability are good in the real world, not just as defined by the framework, and realign that money and spending to maybe invest in a little bit of prediction capability, maybe invest in this, the responsive team. And that's good, because suddenly we're now looking at people and processes rather than just the technology. We're not just buying a box to fill the hole and plug the hole. We're actually investing in long-term capability. But there is something that we probably should mention as part of this. We've done this assessment. We have the view of what the attacker currently looks like. So we've done it now. We know what the attacker is. It's good. We've increased our security internally based off of that current attacker. He's going to improve. He's going to come back completely different. He's going to be, as is natural with any arms race, as we call it, he's going to be improved the next time he comes back. Remember, they're persistent, they're advanced. They have the capability to develop the new tech, the new processes and procedures to do things that they couldn't do previously. So they're going ahead and they're still trying to achieve their objective. So they're going to improve, so we need to improve as well. Something worth mentioning, because our attacker is improving, if we're keeping a dipstick approach and we're testing now, we need to improve our defensive capability. So how do we do that? There's 3 examples there. So it's using real-world examples from something like incident response, taking our red team and making sure that they're simulating active attacks, our internal red team. They're doing research, they're developing the capabilities of the new tools. We're using something like the attack framework that MITRE has developed. This is a fantastic framework for understanding what attackers are currently doing. It's broken down against the kill chain with examples. They're really, really powerful that. And there's many others out there that exist. Using threat intel is one of the ways as well. But we need to also make sure that the people who are simulating our attackers, so our external third party or red team provider, is keeping up to date as well. They need to be doing the same things. They need to be effectively being a red team in order to make sure that we're keeping up. If they fall behind, this whole system is broken. So this leads into a nice example. This wouldn't be a conference talk if we didn't have a case study. And this one's a little bit, I wouldn't say dear to me, because it's an investigation that I did and have been involved in over the last 3 or so years. It's a nice relevant one for Africa because it happened here. So I'm going to give a little bit of background as to what actually happened and when it all started occurring. It's affected 4 to 5 companies now. We're waiting for the confirmation of the 5th one at the moment. But basically, it started off back in 2011 was the official date. We as ZIFSecure didn't do this initial investigation. It's in an African country that targeted a government organization. We spoke to the people who did do the investigation to get the background and effectively what happened. So this APT that we had, or that we have at the moment, it was targeting this government organization to commit tax fraud. So the government wasn't well defended, they didn't have the capabilities, they weren't that advanced. So in many places they didn't even have antivirus running. So the APT pretty much married their capabilities against what they needed to do. So they were using very simple, very basic techniques, tactics and procedures, and completely off-the-shelf key logging software, off-the-shelf viruses. In fact, the key logging software was a bought-for solution that you could use to keep track of what your employees were doing. So it was a legitimate company that actually developed that. After committing their tax fraud, editing the files in the database to actually commit the tax fraud, they were caught. As part of the investigation, they were arrested. Well, not all of them, a couple of them. And after, 5 years, they were released on a technicality, which, yeah. So back in 2017, they came alive and they were active again. This is the investigation where I took over. This is the one that I led. I flew out to the country. We were involved, and basically we looked at it from the beginning. They were taking money out of people's bank accounts, pretty much at will. They'd compromised the estate completely. At this point, the client that we were dealing with was a bit more advanced than the government organization. They had antivirus, they had some prevention controls in place, they had web proxies, so they were a little bit more advanced than what was previously. The attacker, again, had married their capabilities against that. They were using some custom stuff to bypass the AV, but pretty much everything else was off-the-shelf malware. Meterpreter was effectively being used to Metasploit. One of the nice things one of the interesting points here is to bypass the web proxy and the web AV. They were using something called Ngrok. So Ngrok is a developer tool, widely used and very commonly used. It's a great way to hide in plain sight, effectively. It's a great way to get through firewalls and web proxies and that. It's a legitimate site that it connects to, and it just tunnels your traffic out. So that is a way that they bypass that specific preventative control. And then over the next year, we got called into another one of our clients, a much bigger organization with a significantly larger security budget and significantly higher capabilities. So they had EDR deployed. They're widely deployed. They had a team watching it. They had processes and procedures in place. So what did the attacker do to counter this? They ignored where the ADR was deployed and ignored the Windows domain setup and went after the Linux environment. I spent many times covering that Linux environment. The Linux environment didn't have the same capabilities deployed. There was no EDR in the Linux environment. We also know that this attacker had insider involvement and detailed knowledge. We have recordings of phone calls where they were phoning friends and asking them basically, because they had previously worked at this company, and asking their friends basically, what's changed since I've left? Is the environment still the same? What technologies are in use? So they knew very detailed information about where the EDR was, what it was doing, and what the capabilities of the internal team were. After a while, to achieve their objective, they had to target the Windows domain, which, as we mentioned previously, had EDR deployed and had that technology there and the prevention controls in place. It was done much slower, significantly slower than in the previous company or the government organization. They spent time making sure that they bypassed the EDR, hiding their capabilities from the internal security team, firewalling off the EDR, physically turning it off in many cases. Until eventually they realized that the internal response team was so overwhelmed by the amount of data that they were receiving that they couldn't respond effectively at all. Once they got to that point, the attacker just attacked, went wild, and in a couple of days wound up and achieved their objective. They stopped effectively caring that the EDR was there. So we see that even during the course of the incident, they've actually changed their tactics and procedures based on what they're seeing internally. And then just to round it off nicely back to company one, the investigation that I was involved in, that company, the bank effectively in one of the African countries. We deployed EDR as part of our investigation. We kicked the attacker off. They came back 3 months later. We picked them up as they came back, and we kicked them off again. They started to realize, and again, we've got phone calls and conversations where they were phoning the help desk as employees, trying to find out information about what was deployed, what is there, what have they done. And they changed their tactics and procedures completely, stopped going the cyber route. We've got video footage of this, and I really wish I could show it. Unfortunately, the client name is in the video. So they walked up to an ATM, they have a key, they unlock the ATM, plug in a USB drive, and start jackpotting the ATM with old malware. And just effectively hit a button, draw money, hit a button, draw money. So they changed their tactics and procedures completely based off of what we were seeing. So this is one way. So this, just to reiterate my point basically, and this is not the best way to do it, we've effectively gone through a process here where for company one, the attacker has helped them improve their security. It's not the great way to do it. A much better way is to use a simulated response. Okay, and then just to start winding up a little bit, we've spoken a little bit about increasing that internal defensive capability and making sure that we're keeping up to date. There's other ways that we can do this from an offensive perspective. We can take a threat-led approach to many different teams within the organization. So we don't have to only focus on red teams. Red teams have a very specific goal. They aim to achieve and assess gaps within our strategy and give insight into that. We can focus on blue team as well. We can make training available. We can train our blue team to be better at detecting and responding. We can spend time as a purple team, basically improving the capability of the technology and spending time with the attackers and the defenders working together to upskill both sides. And then the final one, or the gold side or the yellow side, whatever color you pick, is effectively taking the time to assess with a real-life simulated attacker and the threat level where it currently is, to assess our crisis capability and our response from that level. And then just a quick summary. Defense is hard. No one has ever said defense is not easy. The attack is constantly changing. Our response needs to keep up. We need to have elements of both the strategy side, so that's important, to set a baseline. We need to have that baseline and the controls in place. But we also need to do the threat-led side so that we can understand how attackers are actually seeing the controls that we've implemented. Let's make sure that our controls have the effect that we actually want them to have. And where they don't, we need to come up with other solutions. Make sure that the red team is keeping up to date with both the attacker and future stuff that is coming. We want to be a little bit one step ahead, because if we can be one step ahead as the internal blue team, that often means an order of magnitude jump that is required by an attacker. We have the internal field. We can set the playing ground. We know what our environments look like. We just need to make time so that we can detect them and pick them up, basically. And then the final one is make sure that you're marrying what you're actually attempting to achieve with the spend that you're doing. So if you've got a specific objective, make sure you can also apply this threat-led approach to multiple different teams within the organization. And that, I think, just summarizes nicely taking the prioritized approach against what you're actually trying to achieve, or what your objectives are from a security perspective. And that's pretty much it, hitting it bang on 20 minutes.
Very good. Thank you, Roy. Thank you very much.